In the sun-baked expanse of the New Mexico territory, three desperate men thought they'd found an easy mark. A lonely ranch house with nothing but a woman inside. Fresh from their prison break and hungry for leverage, they saw Sarah Mitchell as their ticket to freedom. Just another rancher's wife, they figured, someone to use as a shield against the law that was surely closing in. What they didn't know was that before she traded her gun belt for a wedding ring, Sarah Swift Hand Mitchell had been the most feared. Peacekeeper west of the Mississippi, 27 notches on her revolver, each one earned fair and square against the deadliest outlaws in the territory. Now, as these escaped convicts celebrate their supposed victory, she watches, waits, and remembers skills that have never truly gone cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first hint of dawn painted the New Mexico sky in shades of amber and rose. Finding Sarah Mitchell already awake, moving through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Her calloused hands worked the coffee grinder with smooth, practiced motions, the aroma of fresh grounds filling the ranch house kitchen. Behind her, the heavy oak cabinet creaked softly as she reached past the daily dishes to brush her fingers against the false back, a habit she'd never quite broken, checking the hidden compartment where her old Colt still waited. Tom's quiet snores drifted down from upstairs, her husband catching extra sleep after a long night dealing with restless cattle. Sarah smiled at the sound, remembering how different her mornings used to be. 10 years ago, Dawn would have found her checking wanted posters or tracking outlaws across unforgiving terrain. Now her dawn battles were with stubborn sourdough and ornery chickens. She caught her reflection in the window as she poured water into the coffee pot. The same sharp eyes stared back at her, though laugh lines had started to soften their edges. Her hair, once kept severely braided for quick draws, now hung loose around her shoulders. Only her hands betrayed her past, still sporting the same gun-calloused trigger finger, though these days it was hidden beneath flower dust and garden soil. The distant echo of bells carried across the morning air, so faint she almost missed it. Prison bells, her mind supplied automatically before she pushed the thought away. That life was behind her now. She'd traded her badge for a wedding ring, her gun belt for an apron, and she hadn't regretted a single day of it. On her desk, a small stack of unopened letters bore the marshal's office seal. They'd been arriving more frequently lately, requests for help, most likely, or warnings about trouble brewing in the territory. She'd stopped reading them years ago when she and Tom had agreed to build a different kind of life. Sarah stepped onto the front porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun climb higher. The ranch spread out before her, the barn with its fresh red paint, the corrals where they'd break horses come spring, the kitchen garden she'd coaxed from the stubborn soil, all of it built with sweat and hope instead of gunpowder and blood. Covey of quail burst from the brush near the house, startling into flight. Sarah's hand twitched instinctively, muscle memory reaching for a gun that hadn't hung at her hip in years. Some habits died harder than others. She still practiced, if she was honest with herself. Empty drawers and target shooting in the barn. When Tom was out working the far pastures, not out of fear or anticipation, she told herself, but because letting skills fade felt like inviting trouble. The morning stretched out peaceful and quiet, filled with the simple rhythm of ranch life. Sarah fed the chickens, collected eggs, and began working on a batch of biscuits for breakfast. Everything normal, everything routine, everything exactly as it should be. But as she worked, a familiar prickle crept up her spine, the same feeling that used to warn her of ambush or betrayal. Something in the air felt wrong, like the heavy stillness before a storm. Sarah found herself double-checking the kitchen window's sightlines, noting cover and distances, calculating angles she hadn't thought about in years. Just old habits, she told herself firmly, tamping down the instincts that had kept her alive through 100 gunfights. The territory was safer now, more settled. The days of desperados and shootouts were fading into dime novel territory. Still, as she heard Tom's footsteps on the stairs, Sarah couldn't quite shake the feeling that this morning's peace was as fragile as the eggshells in her basket. Tom Mitchell's boots on the wooden stairs announced his arrival, each step carrying the weight of a man who'd already put in hours of work before sunrise. Sarah felt the familiar warmth in her chest as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he spotted the fresh coffee. "Something spooked the cattle in the north pasture last night," he said, accepting a steaming cup. "Might have been wolves, but the tracks weren't right." His calloused hand found hers across the table, a gesture as natural as breathing after 10 years of marriage. Outside, the cattle dogs started barking, sharp, alert sounds that pulled at Sarah's attention. Buck and Scout weren't prone to unnecessary noise. She moved to the window, scanning the horizon with an instinct she'd never quite lost. The dogs stood rigid, facing the eastern road, then abruptly fell silent. "Probably just coyotes," Tom said. But Sarah caught the slight tension in his voice. He knew her too well to dismiss her instincts entirely. "I need to ride out to check those fences in the South 40. Henderson's been complaining about strays getting through." Sarah nodded, pushing down her unease. "Take some extra shells for the rifle," she said, keeping her tone casual, "just in case those aren't coyotes causing trouble." As Tom finished his breakfast, Sarah packed him a lunch with mechanical precision, her mind cataloguing the weapons hidden around the house. Shotgun above the door, rifle behind the grain bins, her old Colt in the kitchen cabinet. Just insurance. She told Tom when they'd first set up the ranch. "Out here, you never knew what kind of trouble might ride in. Should be back before sundown," Tom said, standing and buckling his gun belt. He wasn't as fast as Sarah, never claimed to be, but he was a good shot and a better man. "Try not to reorganize the whole house while I'm gone." His smile carried a decade of private jokes about her restless energy. Sarah returned the smile, stretching up to kiss him. His lips were coffee warm, familiar. "Just don't dawdle with the Henderson boys," she teased. "Last time you stopped by their place, you didn't get home till midnight." "That was one time," he protested. But his eyes danced. He pulled her close. For another kiss, longer this time. When they separated, his expression had softened. "I love you, Sarah Mitchell. Ranch life suits you better than that badge ever did." She watched him saddle his horse from the porch, her body tense with an alertness she couldn't explain. Each morning for 10 years, she'd watched him ride out like this. Today shouldn't be any different. But as his figure grew smaller against the horizon, that old familiar itch between her shoulder blades returned, the one that used to warn her. When gun trouble was brewing, the dog started barking again, more insistent this time. Sarah's hand twitched toward the empty space on her hip where a holster used to ride. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the eastern road, too big for a single rider, too deliberate for a herd. Sarah Mitchell stood on her porch, watching. Her husband disappeared to the south while trouble approached from the east. The morning sun caught the silver strands in her hair, and for a moment she was both the rancher's wife and Swift Hand, the legend who'd never missed a shot. "Well," she murmured to herself, "let's hope I remember how to do this." 3 riders emerged from the dust cloud, their approach deliberate and unhurried. Sarah watched them through the kitchen window while drying a coffee cup, her movements purposefully domestic. Even at this distance, she could read their story. Prison-issue boots, ill-fitting clothes, the desperate energy of men on the run. The leader rode slightly ahead, a tall man with sharp features and calculating eyes. A fancy vest that didn't match his worn clothing suggested he'd already started stealing to replace his prison garb. The brute to his right was all muscle, with hands like sledgehammers and a neck as thick as a fence post. But it was the third, one that caught Sarah's attention, barely more than a boy, nervous energy visible even from a distance. "Ma'am?" The leader's voice carried across the yard, smooth as creek water over stones. "Might we trouble you for some water? Been riding since dawn." His smile was practiced, but his eyes darted around, marking exits and entrances. Sarah dried her hands on her apron, mind calculating distances and angles. Shotgun above the door, 8 steps. Rifle behind the grain bins, 12 steps. Colt in. The cabinet, 3 steps. She pushed the thoughts away and stepped onto the porch, embodying every inch the helpful rancher's wife. "Of course," she called back, keeping her voice steady. "Trough's right there for your horses. I'll fetch you boys some fresh water from the well." The leader dismounted with fluid grace that set off more warnings in Sarah's mind. This one was dangerous, a cobra in human skin. "Much obliged, ma'am. Name's Rake." He tipped an imaginary hat. "My associates here are Bull and the Kid." Bull grunted from his horse, while the Kid offered a nervous half-wave. Sarah noted the bulge of a revolver under Rake's vest, the rifle in Bull's saddle scabbard, the way the Kid's hand kept straying to his waistband. "Sarah Mitchell," she offered, turning toward the well. "My husband's out checking fences, but he'll be back soon." A warning and a lie. Tom wouldn't be back for hours, but they didn't need to know that. "Mitchell?" Something shifted in Rake's tone. "That's a common name in these parts." Sarah kept her movements deliberately slow and unthreatening as she drew water from the well. "Common as dirt," she agreed. She set the bucket on the porch, then stepped back, playing the role of the cautious but polite housewife. Rake moved like a card sharp, all controlled precision. He reached for the dipper, and his vest pulled back just enough to reveal the prison number stenciled on his shirt. Sarah felt the piece click into place. The prison bells this morning, the spooked cattle, these 3 men with their mix of stolen and institutional clothing. "Been a busy morning," Rake commented, watching her over the rim of the dipper. "Heard there was some excitement up at the territorial prison." "We don't get much news out here," Sarah replied, letting a trace of nervousness enter her voice. "Give them what they expect. A simple ranch wife, isolated and afraid." The Kid shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Rake, maybe we should—" "Shut it," Bull growled, and Sarah marked him as the muscle. Dangerous, but not the real threat. "Mrs. Mitchell," Rake's smile turned cold, "I'm afraid we'll be imposing on your hospitality for a while longer. You see, we need a place to lay low, and your ranch is perfect. Remote, well-stocked." His hand moved to his vest. "And you'll make an excellent insurance policy against any law that might come looking." Sarah let her eyes go wide with fear, let her hands tremble as she raised them. She knocked over the water bucket with a clumsy step backward, sending water across the porch boards. Rake's boot slipped just slightly as he moved forward to grab her arm. Perfect. They saw what they expected to see. A frightened woman, alone and helpless. They didn't notice how the spilled water blocked the most obvious path into the house. Didn't recognize how she'd positioned herself exactly 3 steps from the kitchen cabinet. "Inside," Rake ordered, jerking his head toward the door. "Nice. And easy. No reason for anyone to get hurt if you cooperate." Sarah stumbled slightly as she turned, playing her role to the hilt. Behind her, she heard the Kid whisper, "She's scared stiff, Mr. Rake." No, Sarah thought, as she led them into her. "Trap, I'm not scared at all. I'm just getting started." Sitting in her kitchen chair, hands bound loosely with her own dish towels, Sarah let her mind drift to another time while she watched Rake post the Kid as lookout. The ropes were a joke, the kind of knots that showed these men had never worked. A ranch. One good twist and she'd be free, but timing was everything. Just like that day in Tombstone 15 years ago, she'd been younger then, her badge still shiny enough to catch the sun. The Carson gang had holed up in the Silver Dollar Saloon, 7 men who'd cut a bloody path across 3 territories. Sarah remembered standing in the street, the weight of her gun belt familiar as a second skin. Marshal Collins had tried to talk her out of going in alone. "They'll underestimate me," she'd told him, adjusting her long skirts. "They always do." The memory was still crystal clear. The creak of the saloon doors, the sudden silence as she'd entered, the way Jack Carson had laughed when she announced she was there to bring them in. "Well, boys," he drawled, "looks like they're sending girls to do a lawman's job now." She'd taken all 7 of them that day. They never even saw her draw. Just a flash of movement, and suddenly Carson's gun was spinning across the floor, his hand bleeding. The rest had followed in a blur of motion that witnesses would later swear couldn't have taken more than 3 seconds. 7 men, 7 shots, 7 guns, scattered across the sawdust floor. No one died that day, but the legend of Swift Hand was born. The kid's nervous pacing brought her back to the present. He reminded her of young Deputy Williams, who'd started following her around after the Carson job. "How'd you get so fast?" he'd asked her once, watching her practice. "Same way you get anywhere," she'd told him, "one step at a time." She'd practice for hours, drawing and reholstering, until the motion was smoother than breathing. Dawn to dusk, day after day, until she could feel the perfect moment in her sleep. That split second when time seemed to slow and the world narrowed to the space between hand and gun. The memory shifted to the shooting competition in Santa Fe, where she'd first met Tom. She wasn't supposed to enter. It was a man's competition, they'd said. But Marshall Collins had backed her play, and the rules didn't specifically say women couldn't compete. She'd won, of course, beat every hotshot and gunslinger in the territory. Tom had been in the crowd, not competing, but watching his brother. Who was? He hadn't been impressed by her speed. Well, he had, but that wasn't what caught his attention. "You don't enjoy it," he'd said afterward, offering to buy her coffee. "You're the best I've ever seen, but there's no pleasure in it for you." He'd been right. The speed, the skill, the reputation, it had all been about necessity, about survival, in a world that wanted to underestimate her. Tom saw past Swift Hand to Sarah, and for the first time in years, she'd felt like a person instead of a legend. Their courtship had been as quick as her draw. Within 6 months, she'd turned in her badge, and they'd bought the ranch with her competition winnings. The day she'd hung up her gun belt, Marshall Collins had predicted she'd be back. "The territory needs Swift Hand," he'd argued. "The territory needs peace," she'd replied. "And so do I." But she hadn't gone soft. Every morning for 10 years, she'd practiced in the barn while Tom worked the far pastures. Draw, aim, holster, again and again, keeping the skills sharp as a razor, not out of fear or regret, but because some things become part of who you are. A crash from the other room snapped her attention back to the present. Bull was going through her cabinets, looking for valuables. Soon he'd find the false back, and things would get interesting. Sarah flexed her wrists against the loose bonds, feeling the familiar calluses on her trigger finger. "Found some silver," Bull called out. "Real fancy stuff." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The silver was in the drawer below the false back. 3 more minutes, maybe less, and he'd find the gun. Then they'd all learn what happened when you mistook Swift Hand for a simple rancher's wife. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows as the 3 men argued in harsh whispers, thinking Sarah couldn't hear them from her chair. But Swift Hand hadn't just been known for her speed. She'd tracked outlaws across hundreds of miles, reading signs and sounds that others missed. Every word carried clear as crystal. "We should have kept riding," Bull growled, his massive frame casting a shadow across the floor. "Sitting here's asking for trouble. Law'll be checking every ranch between here and the prison." Rake's response came sharp and controlled. "With what horses? Those nags we stole are half dead. Besides, they'll expect us to run south toward Mexico. This place is perfect. Food, shelter, and a hostage to keep the law honest when they do show up." The kid shuffled nervously by the window, his young face pinched with worry. "What about her husband? Mr. Rake, if he comes back, then we'll have 2 hostages instead of 1. Rake cut him off. "But something's not right about this place. Woman's too calm." Sarah kept her expression carefully blank, but inside she smiled. Rake had good instincts. They'd probably kept him alive in prison. Too bad they weren't quite good enough. "Found something else," Bull's voice boomed from the front room. "Look at this. Letters from the marshal's office, lots of them, all unopened. Sarah felt Rake's sharp eyes on her as Bull brought the stack of letters. 10 years of correspondence she'd never read, choosing instead to preserve the peace she'd built with Tom. Now they threatened to shatter that peace anyway. Well, well, Rake said softly, slicing open the most recent envelope with a dirty finger. Seems our quiet little ranch wife has been ignoring some important mail. Listen to this. Dear Sarah, the territory needs swift hand again. Carson's brother is building a new gang. He stopped, his face going still as stone. Swift hand, the kid's voice cracked. Like the lady marshal from the dime novels? Bull laughed, a sound like rocks in a barrel. That's just stories, kid. Swift Hand was a man. Everyone knows that. No, Rake said quietly, danger threading through his voice. Swift Hand was very real, and very much a woman. His eyes locked onto Sarah's face, seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. I spent 3 years in Yuma because of Swift Hand. Watched her take down my whole crew without breaking a sweat. The kid backed away from Sarah, fear replacing his nervous energy. Mr. Rake, if she's really Swift Hand, she's tied up, Bull interrupted. Don't matter who she used to be. Sarah watched Rake's mind working, reassessing everything about their situation. She saw the moment he realized the water spill on the E. Porch hadn't been an accident, noticed him counting the defensive positions she'd maneuvered them into. Check her ropes, he ordered sharply. Now! But Bull never got the chance. The cattle dogs started barking again, drawing their attention into the window. In that split second of distraction, Sarah's hands were already free. Too late, she said softly, rising from the chair with fluid grace as the dish towels fell away. But points for finally figuring it out. Bull's hand dropped to his gun, but Sarah hadn't survived 15 years as a marshal by being slow. I wouldn't, she advised, her voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded respect across 3 territories. I'm giving you boys one chance to walk out of here alive. Drop your guns, walk to the barn and wait for the law to arrive. 3 against 1, Rake said, but she heard the doubt in his voice. And you're out of practice, Swift Hand. 10 years of baking biscuits slows a person down. Sarah's smile was cold as a mountain stream. Want to bet your life on that? The kid's gun hit the floor first, clattering on the wooden boards. Smart boy. Bull looked to Rake for direction, his meaty hands flexing near his holster. Last chance, Sarah warned them, but fair notice, I've had 10 years of peace and quiet. Be ashamed to ruin my record of never killing anyone over something as stupid as pride. The silence stretched tight as a fiddle string, broken only by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the south. Tom, coming back early. The situation was about to get a lot more complicated. Rake's smile turned razor-sharp. Well now, he purred, that changes things, doesn't it? Sarah's mind raced ahead like a runaway horse, calculating angles and options. Tom was riding into a trap, but she couldn't warn him without giving up her momentary advantage. Time to change tactics, please, she said, letting her voice tremble, slipping back into the role of frightened rancher's wife. Don't hurt my husband. Her eyes darted to the window, a practiced tell that drew their attention exactly where she wanted it. Rake took the bait, moving to the window to check Tom's approach. Perfect! 3 steps closer to where she needed him. Sit down, he ordered, gesturing with his gun. Nice and quiet. Bull, get ready by the door. Kid, you keep watching the road. His confidence had returned now that he thought he held the advantage. Sarah sank back into her chair, deliberately catching her skirt on the corner. As she leaned down to free it, her hand brushed against the loose floorboard where she'd hidden her backup derringer. 10 years of ranch life hadn't just taught her about cattle and crops. It had given her time to turn this whole house into a carefully planned fortress. Your husband's early, Rake observed, keeping his gun trained on her. Lucky us. Now you're going to do exactly what I say, or he dies the moment he walks through that door. Sarah nodded, eyes wide with manufactured fear. Anything, just don't hurt him. Smart woman. Rake's smile was cold. When he comes in, you'll act natural. One wrong word, one wrong look, and Bull here will put a bullet in his head, understand? I understand. And she did. Understood that. Rick was smart enough to be dangerous, but not smart enough to win. He'd made the same mistake as every other outlaw who'd underestimated her. He thought fear would make her weak. The hoofbeats grew louder. Sarah let her hands shake as she smoothed her skirt, counting seconds in her head. The derringer pressed. Against her ankle, hidden but ready. 3 more weapons within reach, each one planted during years of peaceful preparation she'd hoped she'd never need. "Mr. Rake," the kid whispered urgently, "something's wrong. He's not alone." Sarah kept her face carefully blank, but inside, her heart leaped. Tom must have run into the Henderson boys on his way back. That changed everything, for better and worse. "How many?" Rake demanded. 2 more riders, the kid reported. "Coming in fast." Rake's face hardened. "Bull, change of plans. Get behind her. Kid, stay by that window. When they come through that door—" "Wait," Sarah interrupted, pitching her voice high with panic. "Please, I'll help you. There's a cellar, hidden door in the pantry. You can hide there until they leave." It was beautiful, really, how eager they were to believe a frightened woman's desperate offer of help. Even Rake, who should have known better, let hope override his suspicion. "Show me," he ordered, gesturing with his gun. Sarah stood slowly, keeping her movements uncertain and afraid. "This way." She stumbled slightly, letting them think it was fear that made her clumsy. Each step took them exactly where she needed them to be. The pantry was dark and cramped, barely big enough for 4 people. Sarah reached for the hidden latch, her body blocking their view of her hands. Outside, horses thundered into the yard. "Hurry up," Bull growled, shoving her shoulder. Sarah's fingers found the latch. "It's stuck sometimes," she apologized, voice trembling. "You have to—" The front door slammed open. "Sarah!" Tom's voice called out. "You here, honey? The Hendersons rode out with me to warn you about— Now!" Sarah's hand didn't move to the cellar latch. Instead, she grabbed the rope that had been hidden there for 10 years, yanking it hard. Above them, the false ceiling of the pantry dropped, releasing a shower of flour that filled the air like thick fog. In the chaos that followed, 3 things happened very quickly. Bull cursed and fired blindly, his shot going wide in the flour cloud. The kid stumbled backward, dropping his gun, and Sarah's hand finally found what she'd been maneuvering toward all along, her old gun belt hanging on its peg behind the flour sacks, the Colt still sitting in its well-oiled holster. "Tom!" she shouted, her voice carrying the authority of Swift Hand for the first time in 10 years. "Stay back! I've got this handled!" The flour hung in the air like morning mist, but Sarah didn't need to see to know where everyone stood. 10 years of living in this house had taught her every creak of every floorboard. More importantly, her ears, trained by years of tracking. Outlaws through pitch-black canyons, picked out each man's position by their breathing and movement. Bull was cursing to her left, his heavy boots scuffing against the pantry floor. The kid had scrambled backward into the kitchen, coughing on flour. And Rake was silent, which made him the most dangerous. "Sarah," Tom's voice came again from the front room, worried but not panicked. He'd seen enough in their years together to trust her judgment. "Stay there, love," she called back, her voice steady as she drew the familiar weight of her Colt. "And tell the Hendersons to watch the windows. We've got 3 escaped prisoners in here." The flour was starting to settle, reality emerging in patches like a developing photograph. Bull's massive silhouette appeared first, his gun pointed at the space where Sarah had been standing moments ago. She'd already moved, silent as a shadow, positioning herself between the outlaws and the door. "Drop it, Bull," she ordered, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once made hardened. "Criminals surrender without a fight. You got about 3 seconds before this gets messy." Instead of complying, Bull swung toward her voice. Sarah's first shot took his gun hand, the second knocked his weapon across the room. The whole exchange took less than a breath. Bull howled, clutching his bleeding fingers, while the kid's terrified gasp cut through the chaos. "Jesus," the young man whispered. The stories were true. All of them. Sarah confirmed, keeping her gun trained on Bull while her eyes searched for rake in the settling flour. "And I've had 10 years to get even better." A floorboard creaked behind her, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the house settling. But Sarah was already moving, spinning away from the pantry door as Rake's bullet splintered the wood where her head had been. She didn't return fire. Rake was using Bull as cover, and Sarah had meant what she said about keeping her record clean. "No killing, not if she could help it. Fast as ever, Swift Hand," Rake called out, his voice tight with something between admiration and hate. "But you're trapped in here with us. How long can you keep dancing?" Sarah smiled, though no one could see it in the flower-filled gloom. "Trapped?" She clicked her tongue. "Rake, I've been herding you boys like cattle since you rode up. This is my home. Every corner, every shadow, I know them all." As if to prove her point, she slapped the wall beside her. A hidden panel popped open, and suddenly autumn sunlight poured into the kitchen from a side window they hadn't known existed. The flour dust lit up like golden snow, and there stood Sarah Mitchell, Swift Hand herself, backlit by the sun with her Colt steady as scripture. "Last chance," she offered, her voice almost gentle. "Surrender now, and I'll put in a word with the marshal about your cooperation. Keep pushing, and they'll be picking flour and buckshot out of you for a month." The kid moved first, raising his hands high. "I'm done, Mr. Rake. She could have killed us 3 times over already." Bull, nursing his bleeding hand, looked between Rake and Sarah. The massive man's face worked through several emotions before settling on resignation. "Kids, right," he rumbled, "ain't worth dying over." But Rake had spent 3 years in Yuma, thinking about Swift Hand. His gun came up fast, faster than most men could manage, pointing not at Sarah but toward the front room where Tom waited. "Drop the gun," he snarled, "or your husband dies first." Sarah's response was a blur of motion. Later, the kid would swear in his statement that he never even saw her move. One moment she was by the window, the next her gun cracked like thunder, and Rake's weapon went spinning away, taking a bit of his ear with it. Rake stumbled backward, clutching the bloody groove Sarah's bullet had left along his temple. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "That's not... You can't..." "Can't what?" Sarah asked quietly, her gun unwavering. "Can't shoot as fast as the stories say? Can't be as good as I used to be?" She shook her head. "The only thing I can't do, Mr. Rake, is let you threaten my family. Now, would you like to try for another ear, or are you ready to surrender?" The kitchen had grown quiet, save for Bull's pained breathing and the soft patter of settling flour. Sarah kept her Colt trained on Rake, but her mind was already 3 moves ahead. The flour cloud had thinned enough to reveal the full scene. The kid backed against the far wall, Bull cradling his shot hand and Rake, dangerous as a wounded rattler, calculating his odds. "Tom!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded possess across 3 territories. "You and the Hendersons might want to step back from the house a bit." "Already done," Tom replied, and she heard the smile in his voice. In 10 years of marriage, he'd learned to read her tone like a trail sign. "Billy Henderson's gone to fetch the marshal." Rake's eyes darted between Sarah and the windows. She saw the moment his desperation overcame his reason. "Bull," he barked, "grab her!" But Bull, massive as he was, had finally learned his lesson. "No, sir, Mr. Rake, I've seen enough. Lady's got us dead to rights." "Coward!" Rake spat, and suddenly he had a second gun in his hand, a small derringer pulled from his boot. Not aimed at Sarah this time, but at Bull. "Do it, or I'll..." Sarah's gun barked once, the sound sharp as a thunderclap in the enclosed space. The derringer went spinning along with 2 of Rake's fingers. His scream of pain and rage filled the kitchen as he stumbled backward into the pantry shelves, sending preserved fruits crashing to the floor. "That's twice you've drawn on folks who were ready to surrender," Sarah said, her voice cold as mountain snow. "There won't be a third time." But Rake wasn't finished. Wild-eyed and bleeding, he grabbed a jar of peaches from the floor and hurled it at Sarah's head. She ducked smoothly, but the distraction was enough. He bolted through the back door, leaving a trail of blood across Sarah's clean porch. "Mom?" The kid's voice shook slightly. What do we do now? Sarah smiled, and for a moment, even Bull took a step back. It wasn't the smile of a rancher's wife. It was Swift Hand's smile, the one that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. Now, she checked her gun cylinder with practiced efficiency. Now you boys are going to sit quietly with my husband and the Hendersons while I go remind your friend why they used to call me Swift Hand. She moved to the door, her stride changing subtly. Gone was the comfortable pace of the rancher's wife, replaced by the fluid motion of a predator. 10 years melted away like morning frost in the sun. Sarah? Tom's voice carried from the front room. You sure about this? Sure as the day I married you, she called back, scanning the yard for signs of Rake's passage. Blood drops on dirt, broken twigs, scuffed earth. The man was running scared, leaving a trail a child could follow. Might be home a little late. Him for supper, though, the kid cleared his throat. Mrs. Mitchell, for what it's worth. I'm sorry about all this. Sarah paused at the door, keeping her eyes on the trail but letting her voice soften slightly. Young man, the world's full of sorry outlaws. Be something different. Be better. She glanced back, seeing him nod earnestly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a snake to catch. With that, she stepped out into the afternoon sun. The familiar weight of the gun belt settled on her hips like a long-lost friend. Ahead, Rake's trail led toward the horse barn, a mistake that told her he didn't. No ranches. He was trapped now, and they both knew it. A distant clatter of hooves announced the marshal's approach, but Sarah didn't plan to wait. Swift Hand had never needed a posse, and she wasn't about to start now. Come on out, Rake, she called, her voice carrying across the yard. Let's finish this before I have to explain to the marshal why there's flour all over my clean kitchen. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered boards glowing amber in the late afternoon sun. Sarah approached with the patience of a mountain cat, each step placed with deliberate care. Blood drops on the dirt showed Rake's path clear as day. Too clear. The man wasn't stupid enough to leave such an obvious trail unless he wanted her to follow it. Getting sloppy, Rake, she called out, voice pitched to carry. Or maybe just desperate? Her eyes tracked the barn's shadows, noting the slight movement of the loft door in the breeze. 3 ways in, 2 ways out, and enough hiding spots to make things interesting. A bullet splintered the wood near her head. A warning shot. Rake's voice followed, strained with pain and rage. Stay back, Swift Hand. I've got enough bullets to bring this whole place down, Sarah smiled. 10 years of ranch work had taught her more than just farming. Bring it down? She reached for the heavy rope that controlled the hay pulley. Now there's an idea. 1 sharp pull, and 100 pounds of loose hay cascaded from the loft, temporarily blinding Rake's position. His second shot went wild as Sarah rolled behind a stack of feed barrels, perfectly positioned to trigger her next surprise. You know, what most folks don't understand about ranch life, she asked conversationally, listening to Rake's movement in the hay-filled air. It's all about systems, irrigation systems, feeding systems. She kicked a lever hidden behind the barrels. Storage systems. The grain chute overhead burst open, sending a waterfall of corn down right where Rake had taken cover. His curse told her she'd found her mark. Remember what I said about herding you boys, like cattle? Sarah moved smoothly to her next position, keeping up the steady stream of talk to mask her movement. This whole ranch is rigged with little tricks like that. 10 years of peaceful preparation just in case. Crazy woman. Rake's voice came from behind a stall now, accompanied by the sound of him trying to shake grain from his clothes. You turned your whole ranch into a trap. Not a trap, Sarah corrected, triggering another mechanism that sent a row of saddles tumbling from their rack, forcing Rake to dodge. More like a conversation, and right now my ranch is telling you that it's time to surrender. A bullet answered. Her, closer this time, but still wide. Rake was shooting one-handed, his injured fingers hampering his aim. Zara could end this quickly now, put a bullet in his leg and be done with it. But that wasn't Swift Hand's way. She'd built her legend on bringing them in alive, and she wasn't about to break that record today. "Your hand's bleeding pretty bad," she noted, hearing the way his breath had grown ragged. "Longer you keep this up, harder it'll be for the doc to save those fingers. Like you care." Another shot, another miss. "You ruined me once before, Swift Hand. 3 years in Yuma because of you." Sarah moved silently through the barn's shadows, positioning herself behind a support beam. "You ruined yourself, Rake. Train robbery was your choice, just like this mess today was your choice." She paused, letting that sink in. "But your next choice could be different." She heard him laugh, a harsh, desperate sound. "Different? There's no different for men like me, only prison or the grave." "That's not true," Sarah replied, and now she let some of the rancher's wife warmth seep back into Swift Hand's steel. "The kid back there, he's young enough to change. Bull, he's already choosing better. Why not you?" For a moment only silence answered her, then the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked. "Because I'd rather die than go back to Yuma, Rake." A burst from behind the stall, gun blazing as he charged toward the barn door. Sarah's first shot took his hat off, the second knocked the gun from his uninjured hand. The third caught the rope holding the heavy wooden door, bringing it crashing down before he could reach it. "That's the problem with men like you, Rake," Sarah said, stepping into view with her gun trained on his chest. "You never learn." 3 years in Yuma didn't teach you to think before you act. Just like today didn't teach you to check behind you. Rick spun around to find Tom and the Henderson boys in the hayloft above, rifles aimed down at him. They'd slipped in through the back while Sarah had kept him distracted. "My wife," Tom called down, and Sarah heard the pride in his voice. "She always was good at getting folks to look the wrong way." Rick's cornered desperation manifested in a movement so quick it nearly caught Sarah off guard. He grabbed a handful of loose grain from his clothes and flung it at the lantern hanging nearby. The flames caught the dust, creating a brief but intense flash that filled the barn with blinding light. Sarah dropped and rolled on pure instinct, a skill that hadn't dulled in 10 years of peace. Above, she heard Tom and the Hendersons shouting, their rifles useless in the chaos. The sound of splintering wood told her Rake had found a third way out, through the barn's weathered back wall. "Stay here," she called to Tom as she regained her feet. "Keep an eye on the other two." Then she was moving, Swift Hand once more, following the trail of blood and desperation into the pasture beyond. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and Sarah read the signs like a well-worn book. Rake was running toward the cattle pens. Another mistake. The man might have spent 3 years thinking about revenge, but he didn't understand ranch life. "Getting tired, Rake?" she called out, keeping her voice steady despite her rapid pursuit. "That hand's leaving quite a trail, making it easy for me." A shot rang out from behind a water trough, the bullet kicking up dirt near her feet. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, noting how the cattle in the nearby pen had all moved to one side, a clear sign of where her quarry was hiding. "You know what I remember about you, Rake?" She circled wide, using the lengthening shadows to her advantage. "You were smarter than this. The train job that got you caught? That was clever. Well planned. This?" She gestured at the chaos around them. "This is just sloppy." "Shut up!" His voice was hoarse, pain and fear making it crack. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you were the one who figured out the train's schedule," Sarah continued, moving steadily closer while keeping her tone conversational. "Know you planned the switch point, timed it perfect. Your only mistake was trusting your partner to handle the guards." A bitter laugh answered her. "That's right. Jenkins got scared, started shooting. Wasn't supposed to happen that way. Nobody was supposed to die. But they did," Sarah said softly. 3 good men died because you planned everything except how to handle a nervous partner. Just like today, you didn't plan for the kid to lose his nerve, for Bull to make the smart choice. You never learn, Rake. The water trough exploded with the sound of another shot, closer this time but still wild. Sarah could hear Rake's labored breathing now, the way it hitched with pain and exhaustion. The hand she'd shot was taking its toll. Could have been different, she continued, using her voice to cover her movement as she crept closer. Could have served your time, come out clean. Plenty of ranches would hire a man who knows his way around horses, no questions asked. Like your husband hired you? Rake's voice dripped venom. The great swift hand, playing at being a farmer's wife? That what you think I should do? Sarah's jaw tightened at the mention of Tom, but she kept her voice level. I chose this life, Rake. Chose love over violence, peace over glory. You could choose too. Still can. Liar! Rake burst from behind the trough, but Sarah was ready. Her first shot knocked his newly acquired rifle aside. The second removed any choice about which direction he could run. Rake stumbled, caught himself against a fence post. Blood dripped steadily from his injured hand, and now from a fresh graze on his shoulder. His eyes were wild, darting between Sarah and the open pasture behind him. Don't, Sarah warned, reading his intention. Cattle are spooked now. You run through that pen, they'll trample you before I can get a shot off. For a moment, she thought. He'd listened to reason. Then something shifted in his eyes, something final and desperate. Rather them than Yuma, he snarled, and turned to vault the fence. Sarah's gun cracked once more, but even swift hand couldn't beat blind desperation. Rake disappeared into the mass of nervous cattle just as the sound of approaching horses announced the marshal's arrival. Damn, Sarah muttered, holstering her gun. She started walking toward the cattle pen, tracking the growing chaos within. Some folks just have to learn everything the hard way. The cattle pen had erupted into chaos, dust rising in the golden afternoon light as the spooked herd moved like a storm-tossed sea. Sarah stood at the fence, her mind racing back to another cattle stampede, another desperate man, another day. When violence had shattered peace, the memory rose unbidden, sharp as broken glass. It had been her last day as a marshal, though she hadn't known it then. A rustler named McCarty had taken refuge in a rancher's herd, just like Rake was doing. Now, she'd done everything right, made all the smart moves, but still 3 innocent people had died when the cattle broke free. Not her fault, everyone had said, but Sarah Swifthand had worn the weight of those deaths like lead in her heart. Sarah, Tom's voice cut through the memory. He'd come up beside her, rifle still in hand, but pointed safely down. Got the other 2 secured with the Hendersons. Marshall's just riding up. He paused, studying her face. You don't have to do this part. She turned to look at him. This man, who'd seen past her legend to the woman beneath. Yes, she said softly, I do. The memory of McCarty had haunted her into retirement, pushed her toward a quieter life. But maybe that had been wrong. Maybe running from the past had been a mistake. Swift Hand hadn't just been about speed and accuracy. She'd been about justice, about doing what was right, even when it was hard. Then I'm coming with you, Tom said, and she heard the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. Cattle. Know me better anyway, Sarah nodded, appreciating both the offer and the practical truth of it. Like that day with the wolf pack, she said, managing a small smile. You kept the herd calm while I dealt with the problem. Difference is, these aren't wolves. Tom's voice hardened. These are our cattle, our ranch, and that man threatened my wife. The dust parted briefly, revealing glimpses of the chaos within. Rake was in there somewhere, injured and desperate. The cattle's movements weren't random anymore. They were being driven, pushed toward the far corner where the fence was weakest. He's trying to break them through, Sarah realized, create enough chaos to cover his escape. Her hand found her gun, the grip familiar as a handshake. Tom, can you circle around to the north gate? He was already moving. Just like the Wolfpack. The marshal's party was closer now, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth. Sarah knew she had maybe 2 minutes before they arrived, and everything got more complicated. Swift Hand had always worked best alone, but Sarah Mitchell had learned the value of partnership. She moved along the fence, timing her steps to the movement of the herd. The cattle nearest to her recognized her, their panic easing slightly at her familiar presence. 10 years of feeding and tending these animals had built a trust that even gunshots couldn't completely break. A flash of movement caught her eye. Rake, trying to push through the herd toward the weak fence. His injured hand was wrapped in his shirt now, but blood had soaked through. His face was a mask of dust and desperate determination. "It's over, Rake!" she called out, her voice cutting through the cattle's noise. "You're just making it worse." His answer was a wild shot that sent the nearest cattle scrambling. Sarah ducked instinctively, but her mind was already counting. 6 shots fired during the chase, 1 more just now. That left him 2 bullets, assuming he hadn't reloaded. From the north gate, she heard Tom's low whistle, their old signal from countless mornings working the herd. He was in position. The marshal's party was closing in. All the pieces were in place. Sarah straightened up, swift hands, legendary speed, warring with Sarah Mitchell's hard-earned wisdom. The weight of that long-ago tragedy pressed against her chest, but something else rose to meet it, understanding. She hadn't failed that day with McCarty. She'd learned from it. "Last chance," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of both her lives. "Surrender now, or I'll show you the difference between desperate luck and earned skill." Rake's laugh cut through the chaos of the cattle pen, a sound as sharp and dangerous as broken glass. "Earned skill?" he shouted back. "Is that what you call it? Let me tell you about earned swift hand. Let me tell you about my 3 years in Yuma." Sarah tracked his voice, noting how he was still moving toward the weak section of fence. But something in his tone made her pause. There was more here than just a desperate escape attempt. "You weren't the only one learning these past 10 years, Rake continued. "Every day in that hellhole, I practiced. Every day, I thought about the famous swift hand." His voice turned bitter as poison. "Bet you don't even remember my partner, do you? The one who died in Yuma." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "Jenkins," Sarah said softly. "He was your brother, half-brother." Rake spat. "But the only family I had. He wasn't built for prison. Lasted 6 months before the consumption took him. A shot rang out, sending cattle scattering. You want to know what skill I learned in Yuma? How to wait, how to plan, how to make someone suffer." Sarah moved smoothly to her left, keeping pace with Rake's progress through the herd. "Jenkins pulled his gun first," she reminded him, "made his choice. He was 17, Rake's voice cracked. "A scared kid who believed his big brother when I said nobody would get hurt. And you," another shot, closer now, "you tracked us. For 3 weeks. Could have taken us any time. But no, the great swift hand wanted an audience, waited until we hit the bank in Mesa Verde, let Jenkins panic in front of the whole town." The accusation hit harder than Sarah expected. She remembered that day, the crowded street, the perfect opportunity to demonstrate why nobody should cross Swift Hand. She'd been younger then, more concerned with legend than life. "You're right," she admitted, surprising both of them. "I could have stopped it sooner, should have. That's part of why I quit." "Quit?" Rake laughed again, but now she could hear tears under the rage. "You didn't quit. You just found a comfortable place to hide, playing house while men like my brother died in chains." The cattle parted briefly, and Sarah caught a clear glimpse of him. Rake's face was a mask of dust and blood, but his eyes burned with a decade of cultivated hatred. He had positioned himself perfectly, using the nervous cattle as living shields while working his way to the fence. "But I found you," he continued, his voice taking on an edge of manic triumph. "Took 3 years of asking questions, calling in favors. Found out Swift Hand had married a rancher named Mitchell. Found out where you lived. Found out about your quiet little life." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The prison break wasn't random, she realized. "You planned it, used Bull and the kid as cover. Finally figured it out, did you?" Rake's grin was terrible to behold. "Had to make it look right. Had to make you let your guard down. And it worked perfectly until that fool kid got scared." A gunshot punctuated his words, but this one came from the direction of the north gate. Tom's warning shot, telling her Rake was getting too close to The weak fence. You want to know what real skill is, Swift Hand? Rake called out. It's patience. It's knowing your target's weakness. He raised his voice to carry across the pen. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, did your wife ever mention she's the reason I watched my little brother die? The cattle shifted again, and Sarah saw Rake had drawn a second gun, small but deadly, pointed not at her but toward the north gate, toward Tom. One more step, Rake warned, and you get to watch someone you love die too. Thunder rolled across the distant mountains as storm clouds gathered overhead, turning the late afternoon light an ominous grey. The cattle shifted nervously, sensing the coming storm. Sarah kept her gun trained on Rake's position, but her mind was racing through options. The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. "Drop the gun, Sarah!" Rake called out, using her given name for the first time. "Drop it, or I put a bullet in your husband's heart." His voice carried the edge of a man who had nothing left to lose. Sarah's response was calm, measured. "If you could shoot straight with that hand, you'd have done it already." She took a deliberate step forward, parting the nervous cattle with her presence. 3 years in Yuma practicing, you said. I've had 10 years to perfect what was already legend. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, casting harsh shadows across the pen. In that brief, brilliant moment, Sarah saw everything with crystal clarity: Rake's position, Tom's silhouette at the gate, the marshal's party drawing up to the south fence. More importantly, she saw the fear beneath Rake's rage, the desperate need to prove himself against the legend that had haunted him. "You think I won't?" Rake's gun wavered between Sarah and Tom's position. "You think I came all this way to surrender?" "I think," Sarah said, her voice carrying over the rumble of approaching thunder, "that you're still making the same mistake you made 10 years ago, still trusting luck over skill." The cattle between them bellowed as another lightning flash lit. Up the sky, Sarah used their movement as cover, closing the distance while Rake's attention was split. She could see Tom doing the same from his side, careful and quiet as all those mornings they'd worked the herd together. "Luck?" Rake laughed. The sound nearly lost in the rising wind. "Was it luck that helped me find you? Luck that got me into your home?" His injured hand was trembling now, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. "No, this was planned. Every detail, every moment." "Except one," Sarah said. And now Swift Hand's steel had returned to her voice. "You forgot to ask why I practiced. Every day for 10 years, why a retired legend kept her skills sharp." Another flash of lightning, another roll of thunder. The storm was nearly overhead now, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall. Sarah could smell the dust and ozone, feel the electric tension in the air. The cattle were moving more frantically, creating chaos that worked to her advantage. "Because, deep down," she continued, using her voice to cover her movement, "I knew someday someone would come. Someone would threaten this life I've built, this peace I've earned. And when that day came..." The rain began in earnest, heavy drops striking the dirt. Rake's eyes darted between Sarah and Tom's position, his composure cracking like the lightning overhead. "Stay back!" he shouted. "Both of you!" But Sarah had seen what he hadn't. The subtle signal from Tom, the same one they'd used countless times working with stubborn cattle. They were in position. The herd was where they needed it. Now it was just a matter of timing. "When that day came," Sarah finished, her voice hard as steel, "I wanted to be ready. Everything happened at once." Tom whistled sharp and high, sending the cattle surging toward Rake's position. Sarah's first shot caught his good hand, sending the gun spinning away. His second weapon barked once, the bullet going wild as the cattle's momentum caught him. Sarah's next 2 shots were precise, calculated, one taking Rake's hat off, the other cutting his belt clean through. As he fell, the cattle parted around him like water around a rock, their training overriding their panic. Tom's voice called them steady, guiding them away from the fallen man. The rain poured down, washing the dust from the air, clearing the scene to its final act. Sarah approached Rake's prone form, gun unwavering. He lay there in the mud, disarmed and defeated, looking up at her with a mixture of hate and horrified realization That's the difference between luck and skill, she said softly, rain streaming down her face. Luck runs out. Skill gets you home alive. The rain fell in sheets now, turning the cattle pen into a sea of mud. Sarah stood over Rake, her gun steady despite the downpour. Behind her she could hear Tom calming the herd, the marshal's men securing the perimeter. But her focus remained on the man at her feet, a man who'd spent 3 years plotting revenge, only to find himself outmatched by the very legend he'd hoped to destroy. "Do it!" Rake spat, blood from his injured hands mixing with rain and mud. "Finish what you started. In Mesa Verde, show everyone the real Swift Hand." Sarah studied him, seeing past the hatred to the wound beneath. "Your brother," she said quietly. "He wasn't the only one who died that day, was he? The man you were, the clever planner, the one who wanted to avoid bloodshed. He died in Yuma, too." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the rage and pain. On Rake's face, his hand moved suddenly, reaching for something in his boot. Sarah's gun didn't waver. "Even now," she said, "you're still choosing the hard way." "Only way I've got left," he snarled, pulling a small derringer from his boot. But before he could raise it, Sarah's gun barked once, sending the weapon spinning into the mud. Her second shot caught his sleeve, pinning it to the ground. "That's 7 times today I could have killed you," Sarah said, her voice carrying despite the storm. "7 times I chose not to. Want to know why?" Rake laughed, a broken sound that barely carried over the thunder. "Because the great Swift Hand never kills? Because you're so much better than the rest of us?" "No." Sarah holstered her gun and knelt beside him, heedless of the mud. "Because 10 years ago I made the same choice you did, faced the same crossroads." She gestured at the ranch around them. "But I chose to build something instead of destroy. Chose to let go of who I was for who I could become." Pretty words. Rick spat, but something had changed in his eyes. Easy to say from the winning side. Nothing easy about it. Sarah's voice hardened. "You think these 10 years were all peace and quiet? Every day was a choice. Every morning I had to decide if Swift Hand would rule my life or if Sarah Mitchell would lead it." The marshal's boots squelched in the mud behind them. "Ma'am, we'll take him now." But Sarah held up a hand, keeping her eyes on Rake. "Your brother died because of bad choices. His, yours, and yes, mine too. But what you do next, that's all on you." For a long moment, only the sound of rain and distant thunder filled the air. Then Rake's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him like water into parched earth. "He wanted to be like you know," he said quietly. "Jenkins. Read every dime novel about Swift Hand he could find. Said you were proof that justice meant more than just a gun." Sarah stood, her heart heavy with the weight of past and present. Maybe he was right. Maybe justice is about the choices we make after the gun goes back in its holster. The marshal's men moved in, helping Rake to his feet. As they began to lead him away, he turned back one last time. "What happens now, Swift Hand?" Sarah felt Tom's presence beside her, solid and real as the ranch beneath their feet. "Now," she took her husband's hand, feeling the strength they'd built together. "Now I go back to being Sarah Mitchell, and you," she met Rake's eyes, "you get to choose who you become next." The storm was passing, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds to the west. Sarah watched as they led Rake away, his shoulders straight despite his bindings. Sometimes, she reflected, the hardest battles weren't won with speed or skill, but with the courage to offer mercy instead of vengeance. "Ready to head in?" Tom asked softly. "Kitchen's still covered in flour." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the rain-washed yard. 10 years of peace, and all it took was one afternoon to turn our ranch into a battleground. "Peace is still here," Tom said, gesturing at their home. "Just got a few more stories to tell now." Together they walked back toward the house, leaving Swift Hand's legend to fade with the storm. The kitchen looked like a war zone. Flour coated every surface. Broken preserves from the pantry made sticky trails across the floor, and bullet holes punctuated the walls like periods at the end of a violent sentence. Sarah stood in the doorway, taking in the chaos while Marshal Cooper and his deputies secured the prisoners outside. "Well," Tom said, coming up behind her, "at least the coffee pot survived." He reached around her to pick up the still warm pot from the stove, miraculously, untouched by the morning's events. "Small mercies," Sarah replied, but her smile held a touch of sadness. She moved to the window, watching as the deputies loaded Bull and the kid into a prison wagon. The young man caught her eye and nodded, a gesture of respect, maybe even gratitude. Behind them, Rake sat silently in chains, his gaze fixed on nothing. Marshal Cooper stepped into the kitchen, removing his hat. "Mrs. Mitchell, or should I say Swift Hand?" His weathered face broke into a grin. "Half my deputies won't believe it's really you. Been telling stories about you to rookies for years. Sarah will do just fine, Marshal." She turned from the window, brushing flour from her apron. "The kid, the young one, he showed good sense at the end there." Cooper nodded, understanding her meaning. "I'll make sure that's noted in my report. Might help him when it comes to sentencing." He paused, pulling out a notepad. "Speaking of reports, don't suppose you'd consider making a statement? For the record." Tom poured 3 cups of coffee, passing them around. "Careful there, Marshal. Last lawman who asked for Sarah's signature on anything got turned down flat. Can't blame a man for trying." Cooper chuckled, "Though I reckon every badge in the territory will be talking about this day for years to come. Swift Hand, coming out of retirement to defend her ranch? That's the kind of story that becomes legend." Sarah sipped her coffee, tasting the morning's normality and its bitter warmth. "Already been a legend, Marshal. Prefer being a rancher these days." A commotion outside drew their attention. The Henderson boys had returned with Doc Matthews from town, and several other neighbors were riding up as well. News traveled fast in ranch country. "Looks like you've got company coming," Cooper observed. "I'll get my men clear of your yard, but Sarah—" He turned at the door, his expression serious. "Thank you for bringing them in alive. Not many could have, or would have, shown that kind of restraint." After he left, Sarah and Tom stood in their flour-covered kitchen, listening to the sounds of neighbors arriving. Already she could hear Mrs. Henderson organizing a cleanup effort, and young Billy Henderson excitedly retelling the story to newcomers. "You all right?" Tom asked softly, his hand finding hers. Sarah considered the question carefully. Her muscles ached from tension and exertion. Old calluses on her trigger finger had reopened, and her peaceful life had been shot full of holes, literally and figuratively. "You know what's strange?" she finally answered. "I thought if this day ever came, if Swift Hand ever had to return, it would feel like failing, like losing the peace we built." She squeezed his hand. "But it doesn't. It feels like completion." Tom nodded, understanding as always. "Because this time you chose it. Not for glory or duty, but to protect our home." "Our home," Sarah repeated, looking around at the bullet-scarred walls and flour-dusted furniture. "Going to take some work to get it back in shape." "Good thing you've got help," Tom smiled, nodding toward the window where their neighbors were gathering. "Though I suspect they'll want the full story while they work." Sarah laughed, a sound of genuine joy that chased away the last echoes of gunfire. "Well then, Mr. Mitchell, shall we go be sociable? After all," she added with a wink, "it's not every day Swift Hand comes out of retirement." Together, they stepped out onto their porch to greet their neighbors, leaving the legend behind in the kitchen with the flour dust and spent cartridges. There would be stories told about this day, Sarah knew, but the only story that truly mattered was the one she and Tom were still writing, one day of peace at a time. Dawn painted the New Mexico sky in familiar shades of gold and rose, finding Sarah Mitchell already awake, just as it had every morning for the past 10 years. But this morning was different. The kitchen still smelled faintly of gunpowder beneath. The fresh paint and her hands bore new calluses from the repair work they'd done over the past week. The neighbors had been true to their word, turning out in force to help restore the ranch. Men patched bullet holes and replaced damaged boards, while women helped Sarah clean every flour-dusted surface. Through it all, the story spread and grew, becoming something larger than life, just as Swift Hand's tales always had. "You're up early," Tom said, his boots creaking on the new floorboards as he entered the kitchen. "More than usual, I mean." Sarah handed him a cup of coffee, taking comfort in the familiar routine. "Marshal Cooper's coming by this morning. Wants my testimony for the kid's hearing. Going to help him then?" Tom leaned against the counter, studying her face in the early light. "Seems right." Sarah touched the freshly painted cabinet that had once hidden her gun. "He made the better choice in the end. Deserves a chance to build something new." Through the window, she could see the cattle grazing peacefully in the repaired pen. No sign remained of the desperate battle that had played out there, though the hands still talked about how Tom and Sarah had worked together to outmaneuver Rake. "Had an interesting visitor while you were in town yesterday," Tom mentioned, his tone carefully casual. "Fellow from a newspaper back east, wanted to write about Swift Hand's return." Sarah turned to face him, eyebrow raised. "And?" Told him he had the wrong ranch. Tom smiled. "Said all we had here was the best rancher's wife in the territory." Before Sarah could respond, hoofbeats announced riders approaching. Through the window, she saw Marshal Cooper and his deputy, right on time. But there was a third rider with them, one that made Sarah's breath catch. "That's Jenkins' daughter," she said softly. "Mary. She must be, 15 now?" Tom moved to stand beside her. "You want me to send them away?" Sarah squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of both, her past and present. "No, some stories need proper endings." They stepped out onto the porch together as the riders dismounted. Mary Jenkins was her father's image. Same gentle eyes, same nervous energy. She clutched a package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Mitchell." Marshal Cooper tipped his hat. "Hope we're not too early." "Coffee's hot," Sarah replied, but her eyes were on Mary. The girl stepped forward, holding out the package with trembling hands. "Uncle Jake, Mr. Rake. He asked me to bring you this," she said. "Said it was important." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a stack of dime novels, worn and well-read, all featuring the adventures of Swift Hand. On top was a note in Rake's careful handwriting. Jenkins believed in the legend. Maybe he wasn't wrong. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah asked. The girl. "Think it's time you heard the true story about your father." As they settled around the kitchen table, marshal, deputy, rancher's wife, and a young girl carrying her family's legacy, Sarah felt the last pieces of her two lives finally settling into place. Some legends, she realized, were meant to be shared. Some truths were meant to heal. Tom poured coffee all around, then took his place beside his wife. Outside, the sun continued its climb into the morning sky, shining down on a ranch where peace and justice had finally found their balance. 1 month after Rake's failed revenge, autumn had painted the New Mexico territory in shades of amber and gold. Sarah stood on her porch, watching the sun rise over a ranch that bore few traces of that fateful day. The bullet holes had been patched, the cattle pen rebuilt stronger than before, and the kitchen gleamed with fresh paint and new preserves on the shelves. The morning paper lay on her kitchen table, open to a small article about the sentencing. The kid, Tommy Williams, she now knew, had received 5 years with possibility of early release for good behavior. Bull got 8 years, having shown genuine remorse. Rake's sentence was longer, but he'd surprised everyone by accepting it. Without protest. "You expecting trouble?" Tom asked, coming up behind her. He nodded toward her hip, where her gun belt now hung openly, no longer hidden in cabinets or behind false walls. "No," Sarah smiled, touching the familiar weight of the Colt. "Just done pretending I'm not both things. Swift Hand and Sarah Mitchell. Turns out they weren't so different after all." A rider appeared on the horizon. Mary Jenkins, who'd taken to visiting the ranch twice a week. The girl was eager to learn ranching, and Sarah had discovered she enjoyed teaching. Sometimes they talked about Swift Hand and the old days, but More often they discussed cattle breeding or the best way to break a stubborn horse. "Got a letter from the marshal's office yesterday," Tom mentioned, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee. "Didn't throw it away this time." Sarah nodded, watching Mary's approach. "Opened it too. They're asking for help training new deputies. Nothing full-time, just teaching them about tracking and peaceful resolution." She turned to gauge her husband's reaction. "Thought I might ride into town once a week. Share what I've learned about choosing the right path. Reckons Swift Hand's got some wisdom worth passing on." Tom agreed. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Long as she comes home after." "Always," Sarah promised, squeezing his hand. "This is where I belong, where both of us belong." They watched Mary ride up, her seat on the horse improving each visit. The girl carried herself differently now, shoulders straight with newfound confidence. She'd started talking about becoming a deputy herself someday, wanting to prove that her father's belief in justice hadn't died with him. Sarah touched her gun one last time, then let her hand fall away. The weight was comfortable now, not a burden of the past, but a reminder of choices made and lessons learned. Swift Hand's legend had brought Rake to her door, seeking revenge, but Sarah Mitchell's wisdom had shown all of them, that there were better ways to honor the past than trying to destroy the present. Ready for another day of ranch. "Work?" she called out to Mary as the girl dismounted. "Yes, ma'am," Mary answered eagerly. "Though I was hoping you might tell more about that time in Tombstone while we checked the fences," Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful morning air. "Well now, that's a story worth telling, right? But first, let's get these morning chores done." She winked at Tom. "After all, a legendary law woman's work is never done, especially when there's cattle to feed and fences to mend." Peace had returned to the ranch, deeper than before because now it was built on truth rather than hidden pasts. Sarah Mitchell walked down her porch steps to greet the new day, both rancher's wife and Swift Hand, finally and completely whole.